Hello and welcome to Tête à Tête, France 24's flagship interview show. Our guest today is Richard Haass. He's President Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations. He served in several senior positions at the U.S. State Department, and he joins us from Scottsdale in Arizona. Thank you very much for being with us, Mr. Haass.
Thank you for having me.
Donald Trump was elected for a second mandate. He resoundingly defeated the outgoing Vice President Kamala Harris. When it comes to foreign policy, Donald Trump promised to end wars both in Ukraine and in the Middle East. Let's begin with Ukraine. During his campaign, he said he could end the war within 24 hours, and he also added that he could do so even before he takes office in January. How realistic is this?
Look, that was what I would call a boast made during the campaign. One of the things that worked in Mr. Trump's favor was that the context of the election was seen as somewhat chaotic in the United States because, say, of the millions of people coming in illegally across the border, and then internationally because of multiple wars. So he was just promising to restore order, to restore calm, which is what a lot of people want to see. But I wouldn't hear those words and translate them directly or substantively into foreign policy. Among other things, as you know, it takes only one actor to start a war, but it takes all those involved to end one. So even if Mr. Trump wants to end wars, in the case of Ukraine, you've got these two other parties, I believe, called Russia and Ukraine. And in the Middle East, it's even more crowded.
We know Donald Trump had a notoriously bad relationship with the Ukrainian president Volodymyr Zelensky. This dates back to his impeachment. Do you think that, in parallel, the fact that he has what he described as a good relationship with Putin means that he will pressure Ukraine to make territorial concessions and maybe bar its entry into NATO?
Quite possibly. Look, I think the idea that Ukraine would have to make some territorial concessions temporarily, what I would call a transitional ceasefire, an interim ceasefire, an armistice, I think is only realistic. The idea that this war would continue until every Russian soldier was pushed out of Ukraine is wildly unserious. So again, what matters to me is the United States prepared to support Ukraine? We'll see. That's a big question mark with Mr. Trump, the military support. And secondly, what are the terms? What are the terms of a proposed ceasefire? And are they reasonable? Are they fair? So I think that remains to be seen. Mr. Trump talks in generalities, but I think in this case, the devil or the angel will be in the details.
I want to emphasize the issue of Trump's relationship with Vladimir Putin. According to the latest book by investigative journalist Bob Woodward, Putin and Trump had half a dozen phone conversations since Trump left the White House in January 2021, including several after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. How much of a concern is it for you?
Look, there's concerns, there's worries, choose what word you want. We have no idea what the content was of those conversations. So, in and of itself, I don't mind that Trump talks to Putin or just about anybody else. I don't mind that they have a working relationship. We need a working relationship with Russia. A year after Mr. Trump returns to the Oval Office, all the nuclear arms control treaties are due to expire, the so-called New START agreements. So we need to have a relationship with Russia. It all depends on the details, on the terms, and is he prepared to press Mr. Putin to make necessary compromises? And I think that's the big question mark here.
Well, obviously, Europe is watching this very, very closely. We remember during his first mandate, Trump pressured the Europeans to spend more on defense, and sometimes he warned that he could pull out of NATO or question Article 5 of NATO. That's the bedrock of the Atlantic Alliance, whereby countries would defend all the others if one is invaded or attacked by another. How serious of a threat is it?
With Mr. Trump, it's hard to know. It could be a tactic to get the Europeans to spend more above 2%. And I would think, by the way, the Europeans should be spending more than 2%, given the reemergence of a serious Russian threat in Europe. And also, the Europeans shouldn't just spend more, they should spend more intelligently. The problem with European defense spending is less the overall effort than it's not integrated. Each country pretty much determines its own defense budget. So as a result, the whole is less than the sum of its parts. So Europe needs to spend more and spend smarter. And if I were European, I would be taking the initiative now rather than waiting for pressure from this Trump administration. I think Europeans should do this, given, among other things, the Russian threat. They should also rebuild the defense industry. The fact that it's difficult to supply Ukraine with the arms it's needed. But that said, I take your other point. There's questions about American reliability, about we've introduced a degree of uncertainty and conditionality, Mr. Trump has, into Article 5. So that's a real concern. But again, if I were European, at least, I would say we can't count on the Americans for the next 75 years, say, to do what they've done the last 75 years. We Europeans have to take greater responsibility for our own defense.
I want to turn now to the Middle East. Trump has signaled during the campaign that he would like the war in Gaza to end. But does that mean signing a blank check to Benjamin Netanyahu?
Well, if he writes a blank check to Benjamin Netanyahu, which is pretty much what he did the first time around, the war won't end, the war will continue. The Israelis have essentially doubled down on their military efforts. And they're reducing more and more of Gaza to rubble. More and more people are getting killed in what I think will ultimately be an unsuccessful mission, because the Israelis have not introduced a political dimension to their policy. The only way to get the war to end is for Mr. Trump to put pressure on Mr. Netanyahu, and then also Hamas has to agree that the war needs to end. So, I think there's big questions in terms of will he give Israel a blank check? I actually think the more immediate question is less Gaza than it is Iran. We'll see if the Iranians retaliate after the Israeli response, and then that could be a very interesting test, either for Mr. Biden, who's still going to be president, by the way, for another 75 days. That could come up then, or it could be an early test for Mr. Trump about whether he is prepared to support and even join in an Israeli military action, say, that attacks Iran's nuclear installations.
Well, do you think Donald Trump could try to pursue what he did during his first mandate, the so called Abraham Accords, the normalization between Israel and several Arab and Muslim states, and especially trying to seal a deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and as a consequence, have some form of recognition of a Palestinian state?
I think it is a possible option. I was just in Saudi Arabia last week. The Saudis are obviously pleased with Mr. Trump's victory. They want to normalize with Israel. Even more, the Saudis want a close security relationship with the United States. They want to have greater nuclear cooperation with the United States. So I think there's a pretty good chance for a deal. A lot of it will depend upon the specifics, the wording of what the Saudis say they need from the Israelis in terms of a commitment to some type of a Palestinian state or a political process. And I would think this is why God invented diplomats. I actually think it's possible to work this out in a way that would be enough for the Saudis and not too much for this Israeli government. So I think that's a real possibility.
I want to go back to Iran. Do you think there's a chance that Donald Trump could provoke or push a fight between Israel and Iran?
No, not. Just to be clear, no, not provoke. You've had two exchanges between Israel and Iran, one in April and one this past month. The choice is Iran's. If Iran retaliates against the most recent Israeli response, then I think there'll be a big conversation in Israel and between Washington and Jerusalem about how to respond to this latest Iranian action. And again, I think it's possible the United States would back a robust Israeli response against nuclear-related targets in Iran. It's something the Iranian leadership had better keep in their minds before they react militarily.
Now, China, obviously a major issue for both the Trump, number one, and the Biden administration. Donald Trump recently told the Wall Street Journal that he would not need to threaten to use force to defend Taiwan against China because President Xi Jinping knows me and he knows I'm crazy. Do you think that this will be enough to deter China from intervening in Taiwan?
We don't say that on news shows in Les États-Unis. But look, no, I don't think it's enough. Predictability, I would say, is better than craziness. You want the Chinese to know what you're prepared to do on behalf of Taiwan. I think what's important is the United States threatened China not just with tariffs, not just with sanctions, but also with military help for Taiwan. I think Donald Trump's talked about Taiwan doing more. The big question mark about Trump and China and Trump and Taiwan is whether Mr. Trump is only prepared to confront China economically or whether he would also be prepared to confront China militarily. And I don't have the answer to that, but I think that will be necessary. I don't think Xi Jinping will be deterred simply by the threat of tariffs or sanctions. Taiwan is simply too important to him. He sees it as his legacy. So I believe the United States must be prepared to do more in order to deter China.
Last question. We remember that during his first mandate, Donald Trump pulled out of the Paris Climate Accords, of the Iran nuclear deal. Do you think we'll see more of the same? Or could he try what he did with the North Korean leader Kim Jong un, trying to find a deal with one of America's arch enemies?
Well, two separate things. On climate, I expect more of the same. I think you'll see a big emphasis early on. The United States is already the world's biggest producer of oil and gas. That'll continue. I see no enthusiasm for participation in global climate diplomatic efforts and the rest. Look, the North Korean nuclear problem and missile problem keeps growing. Russia is apparently making a bad situation worse. I hope Mr. Trump engages North Korea diplomatically, but there's nothing historically to give you any optimism. When we sanction North Korea, it continues to build up militarily. When we have diplomacy with them, they continue to build up militarily. And now that they're getting all this help from Russia, I'll be honest with you, I see this as one of the more worrisome developments that Donald Trump or any American president is likely going to have to face.
Richard Haass, that's all we have time for. I want to thank you very much for appearing here on Tete a Tete, France 24's flagship interview show.
Thank you.
And thank you all for watching it.